Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Krista Pawley, and I'm thrilled to be with you here today. I have the privilege of working with the DIACC and with Identity North and a bunch of other leaders in the digital identity space. And I'm so excited to be with you today to have a conversation with Joni Brennan, who is the president of the DIACC. Joni, can you share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Krista. Thanks so much for the great introduction. And it's a real honor to be a part of this event. So as Krista mentioned, I'm Joni Brennan. I'm the president of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. It's a job where I have the honor and the privilege of helping to bring together different leaders, different stakeholders from around Canada and from around the world to advance an ecosystem where digital identity information can be verified and can be shared in a way that helps to secure and grow our economy and deliver societal benefits to all.
So, Joni, we hear a lot about digital ID, but what is it really? What does it matter? And how is this different from me just using my Facebook login everywhere?
Yeah, it's a great question, Krista. And we, in fact, did a little bit of research last year and found that it was actually quite difficult for most Canadians to conjure up what digital identity meant without some assistance when they were asked. And so what digital identity encompasses, what it means, is it's really about the collection of data that represents you. And so if we think about all the kinds of data that would represent me, whether that's in social media or whether that's in the platform that I use for my school to engage with, those pieces of data about me, those are the things that comprise of what my digital identity is. Digital identity is also the kind of data that I choose to show someone. And so if we think about social media, like if Facebook, for example, there's a few pieces of digital identity that we could illuminate there. One being you need to authenticate. So when you go to Facebook, you have to use a user ID and password. Maybe you use a code on your phone. That's called two-factor authentication. You have to authenticate. And then that data about you, the place where you live, your name, your age, that is what comprises of your digital identity. Now, in the Facebook world, that information is not necessarily verified. So we have to be clear that what we see on Facebook or different platforms like that may not necessarily be true. In fact, it's often not true. So there's different levels of kind of how we verify that information. Now, if you have some sort of data, maybe from your school or from your government or even from a bank or another kind of institution like that, that data is probably more verified. And so, so when we're thinking about digital identity, it's both that data about us. How is that data verified? How do we present it? And what kind of technology do we use to log in and to share that kind of data and ensure that it's not being used for purposes that we didn't intend for it to be used for?
So it sounds like a lot of this it's about trust. It's about creating systems where people can know that, I'm thinking back that old cartoon, it's that you're not a dog on the internet, or as we're seeing right now, and I saw a study a couple of weeks ago, it's over 60% of interactions that we're having where we think they're human are now bots. And so it sounds like digital ID and being able to verify that the person I'm talking to is a person and the one I think it is critical. And a lot of what you're talking about is that trust building. So yeah, how do we do that, especially across geographies where, and thinking in COVID times right now, like I may never meet some of the people that I'm working with or trying to collaborate with. How do we build that trust in a digital environment?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It is a lot about trust, and trust is a word that can mean different things to different people. And so I like to think about trust as being kind of a consistent experience over time that's repeatable and positive. So when we're having a consistent, positive, repeatable experience, that's a trust builder. And I think about what you're talking about with interactions with bots online. When we think about identity, sometimes it's important that we prove exactly who we are. I'm Joni Brennan, president of the DIACC. There may be times when I need to prove that very specifically with my name and my role and my organization. There are other times that perhaps all we need to know is is it the business that we think it is, or is it the same being returning? And I don't necessarily need to know that person's name or that person's age, but I do need to know that it's the same being that has come back, over time, over and over again. And that kind of a scenario is something that, for example, like a whistleblower or somebody who needs to have a dissenting opinion and may need to prove, okay, it's the same person, but not necessarily exactly who it is. So in terms of how do we verify and build that kind of trust across different lines? Well, I would say that there has to be a degree of diversity, and there has to be inclusivity in terms of how digital identity moves forward. And one of the things that I think about, whether we're here in Canada, whether you're anywhere else in the world, I think that identity is kind of at the intersection of our culture and of the way that our government is organized. And so if we think about that, quite often the problems that we're trying to solve or the opportunities we're trying to leverage, they're basically the same. No matter where we are, there are patterns to the kinds of problems that we would solve with digital identity verification. But the way that we solve them and what's acceptable, that is local. So you have the universal common problems and the local in terms of the culture and governments and governance. And so I'll give an example there. If we needed to verify a particular piece of information about somebody to know that they should be accessing data or that they should be participating in a transaction, it might be the case that a piece of data that is considered to be common knowledge and public in Sweden, as an example, that very same piece of data may be seen as something that's private and needs to be protected in Germany. Now, your examples may vary widely depending on where you are in the world, but one culture's concept of privacy may be very different than another culture's concept of privacy, and that's completely acceptable. And that's not a judgment. That's very cultural. So when we're thinking about how we do this across the world, we have to think about, it's important to have that global view with respect to the local culture and governments. And we have to encourage, and not only encourage, but really drive those different opportunities to speak with each other, to share, to work together. So we have that inclusivity and we have that diversity. And that's not only because it's the right thing to do from a societal perspective, because it is, it's also the right thing to do to make sure that we have the best approach, the best service, the one that has taken in this wealth of perspectives from around the world, and so that we can actually plan and design for inclusivity and for diversity from the beginning. So I think we need to encourage those conversations. We need to do more by learning and working together, and we need to do that across the world. And really amplify all those stories and build in inclusivity and diversity as a principle by design in any of the work that we're doing.
I think that's one of the powerful things about the identity space, is that because we don't have the same legacy institutions where we're now talking about trying to reverse engineer inclusivity, that we can actually build something inclusive from the start. And I know that you've been working a lot with the members of the DIACC, and there's over 80 of them from the public and private sector, to create the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And one of the principles there is interoperability, and recognizing that we live in a global world and that there's going to be a need not to create frameworks that work for single small geographies, but actually recognizing that many of us are hopefully going to be able to start traveling again. And as we seek to do that, and as information moves around the world, that, again, coming back to that trust factor, that we need to know that information and people can move around the world, and that if I show up in Canada, that I'm going to be able to prove who I am, what education I have, what resources I have, that I've had vaccines, or any of those types of pieces. And that interoperability piece is so critical and really exciting. And I think that the focus that you've brought in, that the ID world has brought into this principle of inclusivity, has enabled that surfacing of new ideas and new perspectives. In thinking of what you were saying there, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day who is actually leading some really cool coding work in Africa, but here in Canada is doing some neat work with a women's shelter. Yeah. And this young woman happens to be, she's a young woman, and she's a Black young woman who is living in a very different from community from where I live. And she said, I'm working on a project to try to figure out how we create a safe space for women at risk during COVID where they're locked in, and how do we create a digital environment? And I'm looking at ID and how do I make sure that the person who goes in is this woman and that people that her credentials aren't co-opted. I have to be honest, I don't think that a white man living in an urban center would have even thought of that challenge. So one of the really cool things about the identity space is that it's so open to anybody to come and bring their experience and bring their learning, and you don't have to be an expert. In fact, everybody's expert, and we're building this together as a new infrastructure. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the identity space for people who are learning about it, is that not everything is set in stone, where before we had to break down infrastructure. That's not the reality in identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, go, please.
Sorry, you touched on something that I really have to bring up because so I have just a personal experience with that, exactly what you talked about, and you know there was a time early in my career when in the identity management field, and I was talking with a group, and I'll just say that when I started in industry, I was lucky if there were 2 other women with 25 men in the room, you know, I mean, so we were lucky if we had 1 or 2. That has changed over time, and that's good, but there's much more to do. So we had this conversation, and I basically had said, yeah, it was a time when I had protected my phone number. And so, you know, if I were to call someone, it would show up as like an unlisted number. It wouldn't have my phone number on it. And so basically, someone said, well, you know, I think that you should always be exposing that kind of information about, you know, your phone number and who you are, and then somebody's more likely to answer on the other side. And I had said, well, I actually had an issue where I had somebody who was actually, you know, kind of a stalker, and it was, you know, and for me, my experience was, no, I don't want that information to be out there. I want that information to be protected. And so, you know, that story could go in any direction, but the point being is that the people on the other side hadn't had any of those negative experiences, you know, with people taking advantage of information or, you know, misbehaving in ways that they shouldn't. And so they hadn't even thought about the idea about whether a phone number should be revealed or not be revealed, and what that would, you know, what that would mean in operation. So I think that's so right. You know, we have to have those voices in, and there is so much work to be done for engaging women in the space, for engaging First Nations into the conversation, and it's good that we have different perspectives, and it's good that we share them with each other, because that's the way we make solutions better at the end of the day.
So I think that's a really interesting point to kind of dive in, and knowing that we have students with us today from around the world. And knowing that there isn't a formal curriculum. You're not going to be able to go and do a degree in identity management right now. So, Joni, you've talked about your evolution. What does a career look like in identity management?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, it's unfortunate. You can't graduate today with a degree in digital identity, at least not to my knowledge, and we'd certainly like to change that. And in terms of my personal journey, the way that I got involved in this field is that when I was at university, I was in one of the first university level programs that was at least information technology focused, and we learned about standards, and I thought, wow, standards sound really interesting. You don't work for a specific organization. Well, you work for a standards group, but you actually work across many different kinds of organizations, public sector and private sector, and you try to bring organizations to a common space where they have a common view and a common set of goals. And so there's a lot of bridge building there. And to me, that sounded just fascinating. And I was very driven by being service oriented and wanting to be in the nonprofit sector. I started that journey actually with as a webmaster, as a web designer. So I started in the web designer space, and then was working on an array of different technology focused standards projects, and one of them was around identity. And I had a sense that of all of the projects that were available, the one that was focused on identity was the one that was most human. And so to me, that was very attractive, that it was about technology, but it was also about behavior. It was about people. It was about society. And that made it very attractive as an area and a place to focus. And so one of the things is, yes, we don't know that you can actually graduate with a degree in identity management today, and that's something we want to change. And we're working together with DIACC members and with others and with universities on helping to convene discussions and activities that would lead to what would be a shared curriculum with regard to digital identity that could be deployed in universities, for example. Now, of course, what a degree in identity would look like would be very multidisciplinary. And so there are elements of human-computer interaction, user experience, cybersecurity, communications and marketing. And so identity really is a very, there's a core body of knowledge, and then there's a lot of specialization that can happen in terms of, do you want to go into cybersecurity? Quite often, identity-related jobs aren't listed as identity management-related jobs. They're listed as cybersecurity jobs, or they're listed as user experience jobs. So it is very multidisciplinary. So you should think about if the space is of interest to you. There's a core kind of common knowledge. We do have a relationship with a group called Identity Professionals, or ID Pros. They're actually the world's first professional society for identity management professionals, and they have a body of knowledge that is available that anyone can access. So I would say have a look at the body of knowledge. And then what we hope to do is to work together to have curriculum, because what we hear and see in the industry is that there is a shortage. This space around identity management, as social media grows, as we're in a time of COVID and social distancing, as we get more and more digital as a society, the work around digital identity only gets more and more critical, more urgent, and more important. And what we're hearing is that there is a shortage of qualified students coming out of university who have that skill set, who can meet the needs of the workforce and get access to these great jobs and these great opportunities. So I would say, think about if this space interests you, the intersection of technology, the human side, society, and then think about if there's a way that you might like to specialize, whether that's into security or user experience or communications around this kind of work. Have a look at that body of knowledge from the Identity Professionals Association. And, finally, I think we're very happy to engage as DIACC through LinkedIn, through Twitter. We love working together, and we really believe that identity is best solved by a village of collaboration. And so for anyone who wants to reach out to us, we welcome those kinds of reaches, and we'd love to talk to you if you are very interested in the space.
Amazing, Joni. Thanks so much. And I have to second that, having spent a number of years in the identity space, you've hit on a couple of the characteristics that I absolutely say are key to and common across the space, which is it's one of the most curious group of people I've known. They are imaginative. They're thinking about a future that doesn't exist yet, and they're passionate about designing that. They're really putting humans at the center of the experience and thinking about what does it mean, who am I, and what is my identity, and how do I express that? And thinking about that impact and how to make a difference in the world. And I'm obviously biased because I have the privilege of working with you and others in the space, but to me, it is one of the most exciting and impactful spaces where we can really start to bridge that digital divide and create inclusion, not just on a local, but really on a global scale. Joni, thank you so much for the time today. And to the students who are with us, thank you for being with us. And as Joni said, if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation.
Yes, we need you. Please stay engaged and please engage and continue to learn in this space. We need you. We need your talent. We need your diversity, and we need your representation into this space.
Thanks, Joni. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Krista. Thanks, everyone.